Welcome back to Crestfield's Business. Jamaica is making plans to reopen and start welcoming tourists again. There'll be new safety measures at the airports, seaports and resorts. Visitors might need health certificates or some form of health passports, or how that will work isn't clear. The travel and tourism is nearly a third of GDP for Jamaica, and the sector outpaces the island's overall growth at 7% for the sector's growth. Excuse me. The recovery is contingent on external factors, but here's the really important point. Nearly two-thirds of visitors come from the United States, and that raises a whole host of issues. Joining me is the Prime Minister, Andrew Holness, the Prime Minister of Jamaica. Prime Minister, thank you, sir, for joining us. And I read your statement or your speech to your nation last week and earlier this week, and you were very blunt and you were very brutal about it. You said that there's a reality that we keep dancing around, and the reality is we must ensure our economy gets as close as possible to full capacity. But how realistic is that, Prime Minister?
It's a very realistic proposition, Richard. And let me invite you to be one of the first tourists to come back to Jamaica. I keep telling the Jamaican people that I have two priorities. Priority number one is their health and safety. And priority number one is their livelihoods. So I don't see a trade-off between health and economy. I don't see the two things as mutually exclusive. You need healthy people to make the economy work, and a working economy gives you healthy people. So for us as a government, we're trying to ensure that we balance these two very critical objectives. And tourism plays a very important role in that. As you outline the figures, we depend heavily on tourism. Tourism is our #1 foreign exchange earner, accounting for over 50% of the foreign exchange that we earn. So we have to start planning from now for the reopening and recovery of the industry.
Okay, so taking that on board, Prime Minister, you also say Jamaica does not have the luxury of other economies with large savings. Jamaicans have to live with the COVID pandemic, but you're not going to be able to create the so-called travel bubble or travel corridor, are you, with the United States, where in many cases COVID levels are much higher than you will have experienced. And the last thing you want is to import coronavirus.
Precisely. So we have to plan in advance and anticipate when our largest tourism market would be ready for us. What we would want is for the United States to be ready, Canada to be ready, Europe to be ready, and we are not. So we're preparing. You know, the tourism industry is very susceptible to global shocks. And this would not be the first global shock that our tourism industry would have. And indeed, within the Caribbean countries, we are already very much aware and sensitive towards these global shocks. So we are resilient. So part of being resilient is to plan for it. So what we're doing now is to ensure that we have the protocols. And as you have said, we are already figuring out ways how we can have controlled corridors of entry, how to move our tourists safely from airports to hotels so that they can enjoy our lovely beaches and our lovely people. We are already training our workers, because that's key towards providing the kind of service that people would need in the post-COVID environment.
And this idea of some form of travel certificate or health passport, you're not the only country that's working around this idea. It's very difficult to see how it works. It's a great idea in principle, but if you bear in mind it can be out of date the next day, because unless you're like myself and already had COVID, and even then you're not sure if you can catch it again.
Well, I think it's the information that is important. One, you want to have at least some health profile understanding of the visitor that is coming. And that process itself helps the visitor to be aware of the protocols that they would have to follow. And then we would begin to be able to see whether or not, determine the risk profile of the visitor who is coming and the measures that would have to be in place on the Jamaica end to ensure that we can cater to any needs that those risk profiles would throw up.
Prime Minister, thank you. I look forward to you and I continuing the discussion, preferably and hopefully on one of Jamaica's beautiful beaches. Thank you, Prime Minister.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. Let me know when you're coming.